Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Washington of the CAYL Institute, and we're happy to have you here. This is a webinar series that CAYL has been having throughout 2021, and it's my honor to welcome you to the CAYL Catalyst webinar series. Our goal is to bring you timely, relevant, and immediately actionable information that is of interest to young children and to the people who raise and educate them. So welcome. We are the CAYL Institute, and that stands for Community Advocates for Young Learners. We have a vision, and our vision is that we want to live in a nation where all children have the right to a high quality, culturally competent early childhood education, and that right is embedded in public policy, professional practice, and with family engagement. On the call today, we have hundreds of you who have been involved with CAYL for many, many years. And we also have people for whom this is the first time that you've connected with CAYL. So we welcome you and invite you to go to our website and learn more about the services we offer and what we do. Today, we have a really interesting program. Our topic today is something that is of great interest to all of us in the early childhood education field, and that is the workforce crisis that we're facing right now. And it is not dramatic at all to call it a crisis, because it is a crisis. Our CAYL webinar series always brings topics that we issue as an invitation and a challenge. It's an invitation for you to engage in these conversations about what's happening in the field of early childhood education. And it's a challenge because it's time for all of us to really engage with these issues, to understand these issues, to think simultaneously about where we're going in our future as a field, and at the same time, to think about how we're going to work together to get there. So it's an opportunity for us to think about early childhood education as a field of practice, and also to think about our collective responsibility to advance the field. This webinar is really brief. It's only an hour. And so we really encourage you to put your questions in the chat or to make comments as you hear what the speakers are saying. We really want to hear from you. And because it's so difficult to find a time that works for all of our audience across the United States and in other countries, we always record our webinars so that people can have access to the information at a time that's convenient for them. So today, we're asking 3 knowledgeable people, Leah Austin, Rosemary Hernandez, and Joanne Borinski, to talk about the childcare crisis and what we can do about it. How can we stabilize our very fractured profession? How can we transform this profession? What's going to be the impact of all of this talk of new federal legislation and what it's going to mean also for all of us in our states? These are questions that are going to require our ongoing vigilance and advocacy, and they're of serious importance to all of us right now. So many of our colleagues are feeling the pain of these dilemmas. It's challenging to think about the future of early childhood education when the coronavirus pandemic is weighing so heavily on our daily practice. In every place and in every setting, there's new safety protocols, heightened infection mitigation efforts, fewer children and families being served, and increased expenses to do the work that we do. So the field stressors are very abundant, persistent, and intersectional. How can we deliver quality programs? How is any of this ever going to be affordable for families? Our financial models simply are ineffective. There's still fractures between us in different early childhood education sectors. The workforce is horribly undercompensated, and there's a tangle of inequities for children, families, and communities that result from years of neglect of this field. Yes, There's a lot of stressors in this field, but there's also solutions. And today's topic for our learning and for our discussion is a matter that many of us feel deserves our highest urgent attention to think about solutions. The labor shortage that is creating chaos for families, programs, and communities. There are thousands of fewer spots for children. There are many classrooms within centers that are closed for lack of staff. And this is affecting families and children, and especially women in the workforce. Hiring is a top priority for almost all childcare programs. If you're a childcare preschool director or hiring manager, you are well aware that when it comes to finding teaching staff, you can't find any. And as a director or hiring manager, you're also well aware that it's at best challenging to pay the living wage that attracts highly qualified staff. There are some people who've been writing that the workforce crisis or shortage is getting worse because we're in a booming economy. In this economy, they say, childcare jobs are even less attractive than they've always been from a compensation point of view. One recent report that just looked at past summer said that there were 10,000 childcare jobs lost just over the summer. And though our field was already faltering due to multiple systemic concerns, COVID-19 further unhinged the field's workforce. Many early childhood education professionals were suddenly unemployed, underemployed, worried about employment, or engaged in many new procedures while they were working. Many people are pointing to COVID-19 as making the bad situation even worse because staff and potential staff are worried about their own safety and the safety of their families and dealing with the challenges of all of the new hygiene procedures that have been put in place. So here is the dilemma that we're going to talk about today. The country's media is talking about early childhood education as an essential service for our country. And yet, even though they're calling our team members essential workers, the fact is there's so many inequities, essential, but very inequitable. So in the midst of all these national headlines, what can we do? What can we look forward to? Today, we're going to talk about this dilemma of being both essential and facing so many inequities. And we're going to have a terrific group of speakers to talk with you about this. Dr. Leah Austin is the Executive Director for the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment at the University of California in Berkeley. And we also have two very distinguished practitioners, Rosemary Montero Hernandez, who's a regional director of a Clarendon Education Services in Massachusetts, and Joanne Borinski, who is a master teacher, also from Massachusetts. So what's the future of the early childhood workforce? How are we going to address the issues of higher education, compensation, voice for our workforce, and even very fundamentally, the purpose of what it is we're trying to accomplish? What's going to happen in terms of degrees and credentials and the field getting the respect it deserves, which is also tied to our ability to recruit talented people and to keep talented people? And are we going to be able to sustain a mixed delivery system? These are all questions that are facing us right now. So join me as we listen to Dr. Leah Austin and Rosemary Hernandez and Joanne Borinski. And after we hear their comments, we're going to have a group conversation about some of the points they discuss. I'm really excited to hear what this panel has to say to us. So I'm going to turn it over right away to Dr. Leah Austin. Welcome, Leah.
Hi, thank you so much, Valora and the CAYL team, for inviting me to take part in this just really, really critical discussion. And I'm honored to be here today alongside Rosemary and Joanne. And I know as I can see from the chat, there's also many educators joining this session today. And so I want to first just express my gratitude for the work that each of you as classroom teachers, directors, and family childcare providers are doing every day, and in those conditions as Laura was describing them. You know, you have been on the front lines of the pandemic, and frankly, you've been frontline workers for America's children, our families, and our economy long before this pandemic ever arrived. And as Valora was describing, you know, we hear all of the time now talk of how essential early care and education is, how this is a critical component of our nation's infrastructure. And so what we have to get to in this country is transferring that recognition from the service as being essential to how essential early educators are as individuals, as participants, as the people who make early care and education happen. And we are at a moment in this country with the Build Back Better Act where there is real potential to transfer the recognition and appreciation into the rights, raises, and respect that early educators are long, long overdue. You know, when I first entered the early care and education sector, which was now about 20 years ago, I was working in a professional development program for home and center-based educators. And I can clearly recall this. It was my third day of work, and quite honestly, I wasn't totally sure what I was doing, but I was responsible for managing an enrollment day. This is before everything was online. So it was a Saturday, and we had to literally have hundreds of educators come to this enrollment site to sign up for this professional development and stipend program, something that's kind of akin to the TEACH program. And so for me, a couple of things happened that day that have just really carried with me. The first is that I just encountered an amazing group of women who would become my life mentors and role models, women who recognized that day kind of my deer in the headlights look and my inexperience, yet they took it upon themselves to, you know, bring me into their fold, to teach and mentor and frankly just school me about what it meant to do the hard, complex, and tiring work that they were doing every day as educators and caregivers. And the other piece of that is, as people were coming and enrolling that day and bringing their paperwork, they had to bring information about their employment and their wages. And really, I was shocked. I didn't know, I didn't understand how horrible and low wages were. And I couldn't then, and have not now, 20 years later, been able to reconcile the work and contribution to our communities and society that early educators make with the pay and working conditions that they experience. And eventually, this motivated me through a series of steps and experiences to find my way here to the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment. And here at the center, you know, we're a purpose-driven organization. We're grounded in research and policy development and on centering educators' experiences. Marcy Whitebook founded the center in 1999, and she was once an infant and toddler teacher, and she maintains to this day that that is the hardest work that she's ever done. And so from the outset, the center has been dedicated to researching and uplifting what educators need to do their jobs well and ensure their own well-being. And what we've learned from educators is pretty straightforward over the years. That as educators, you need access and conditions to engage in good preparation and ongoing learning, that you need safe, supportive working environments, including paid time to do all of the things that you do in addition to teaching, right? Planning and preparation and paperwork, assessments, and if you are a family childcare provider or an administrator, there's a whole other host of responsibilities that you have. And you need appropriate compensation, including wages and benefits, so that you can support yourself and your family without worrying about how you're going to pay your bills or put food on your own table. But as educators, you know all too well that these straightforward needs have just not translated into effective and equitable policies as of yet. And caregiving and education, early education, labor that is intertwined and simultaneous, labor that is performed almost exclusively by women 40% of whom are women of color, is grossly undervalued in this country. ECE represents our most racially diverse sector of the teaching workforce when we compare that to K-12 and post-secondary education. Yet, early educators are among the lowest paid workers in every state across the country. And data across states tells us that among these jobs in which people are struggling as a whole, that women of color, and in particular Black women and women who are working with infants and toddlers, are systematically paid less than their peers. Nationally, the childcare workforce is paid on average $12.12 an hour. That translates to 98% of other occupations in this country being paid more than childcare workers. A consequence of that is that poverty rates are incredibly high, 8 times higher than that of K-8 teachers. In my home state, as an example, the poverty rate of the childcare workforce is twice as high as it is for workers in California in general. Infant and toddler teachers at every level of teacher education, so whether the teachers were comparing those with bachelor's degrees or associate degrees or some college, not quite a degree yet, are paid less than those who are working exclusively with preschool age children. And again, to give an example from my home state of California, that can translate into a difference of about $6,000 a year in pay. We also know from our research that Black early educators are systemically paid less, 78 cents less per hour than their peers. And when we look at that wage gap between infant and toddler and preschool teachers, it gets even bigger for Black educators than their peers, to the tune of about $2,000 a year. So such economic hardship is, has an immediate impact, obviously, on people, but it also is carrying with people in the long run as we think about your earnings and how much impact that has on how long you work and what you contribute to retirement, or if you can contribute to retirement. All of this, carries with people for the long run. And so this economic hardship is just really, of course, challenging and completely at odds with the complex skill and knowledge that's required to effectively care for and educate young children. And it's in these conditions that we then entered the pandemic. So as Laura alluded to, this system was faltering to begin with. And so those of you who are doing this work, what this has been like in the pandemic. And Laura again alluded to that, right? The added stress, the worries, the uncertainty, the financial insecurity, and your efforts have been Herculean, but really they shouldn't have had to have been, right? You should not have had to face the decision to place your physical well-being or your financial well-being on the line, or worrying about your own family's health. You should have been provided opportunities for safe and stable closures, if and when that was needed, and resources for safe and stable operations when open. So it's not a surprise that across the country, again, as Laura was talking about the job loss, that as of now, we've lost about 105,000 jobs in the sector since the start of the pandemic. And in some really hard hit states like Massachusetts, jobs today in early care and education are just 70% of what they were before the pandemic. And then you have companies like, Target and Starbucks and, McDonald's, who are offering starting wages at $15 an hour, who are boasting that they're now including benefits like health insurance and college tuition. And early care and education, we can't compete with that, right? At least not without new funding and a system that is radically different from what we have today. But there is hope for change. As I mentioned, for example, by Build Back Better and the Build Back Better plan and some things we're seeing happening at the state level. If the federal Build Back Better initiative, which still has a long way to go, but if it were to move forward in its current form, that alone would mean 380 or 90 billion new dollars for early care and education, new resources. And what's important about that is that there are specific provisions to improve pay for the workforce in that act. On more than one occasion, too many occasions, I have been told that I shouldn't present such depressing data, or that here I come, or here comes someone from the center being the bearer of bad news when we present these data about wages. Or I've been asked or told that I shouldn't go and ask educators about their wages or the impact of low wages, as that might, make them feel bad or bring them down somehow, as if like we're revealing something that as educators you don't already know from your lived experience. And so my read on these requests is that they've been more about keeping educators isolated and interpreting experiences as individual and not collective, or not connected to broader systemic issues. And so, I present these data on wages and racial wage gaps and our inequities, not to be bringing bad news or the bearer of bad news, but to be forthright and to underscore that the conditions for educators are collective, and that the key to that is that there is power in the collective. The reason we see specific wage provisions for the ECE workforce in the Build Back Better Act is because educators have talked about their conditions, have organized themselves into groups and unions and collectives, because wages and working conditions have been documented and publicized, and because current systems have been called into question and are revealed to be inadequate. And so to maximize opportunities like Build Back Better, and I think realize responsible reforms that work for the education workforce as much as they're intended to work for children and families, we have to be very intentional and careful that new policy reforms are brought forward in a way that they disrupt these inequities that are woven throughout our systems and not reinforce them, right? So, if we got Build Back Better tomorrow and everybody gets, let's say a $15 an hour pay increase. This is hypothetical and an example. Like, that's great. We're moving things up and forward. But if we're doing that without attention to the wage gaps we see, for example, the racial wage gaps, the wage gaps between infant and toddler and preschool teachers, we are moving the floor up, but maintaining those disparities and inequities. And so, there's real opportunity to figure out, how do we dismantle this? How do we ensure that we're raising the floor, that we're improving conditions, and we're doing it in a way that's equitable for our workforce? And to further maximize these opportunities, we have to pay attention to the details and ensure that they're moved forward in a responsible way. So when the Build Back Better Act talks about childcare workers earning a living wage, that's really important. And it's really important to question and clarify what that means. What is a living wage? Let's be clear about that and have, consistency in what that looks like in California, their formula compared to Massachusetts or Texas or New Mexico. And that's similar regardless of the age of child that you're working with. And as Build Back Better or other proposals talk about childcare and preschool, again, it's important to clarify for policymakers that those who will implement policy, that teaching and caregiving is happening across the age span, and they're happening together. And the needs of this workforce in terms of working condition and pay aren't changing suddenly because a child's birthday moves them from being called a toddler to someone who's preschool age. And so these reforms, potential reforms, are bringing tremendous opportunity and also present really important questions and critical perspectives that we have to bring to this to make sure, again, that it's working for the workforce as much as it's working for children and families. And I think critical to any of these reforms moving forward and doing so in a responsible way and really tackling the wage question and bringing forth proposals that we know are going to work. We have to have educators central to that, right? Educators coming together, exercising power, being acknowledged and sought for your expertise. That's really going to be central to shaping reform. And so I am really excited to hear from our other panelists today, as they are practitioners, they're members of the workforce, and they're experts about the workforce. So I'm excited to hear from them. I'm really pleased to be here, and I have the pleasure now of turning it over to Rosemary.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. What a great job in putting us forward in this such important topic. And I appreciate the CAYL Institute for bringing this topic in the forefront of the workforce, that it's so important to build connections, not just for children and families, but research well supports that if we have a workforce that is content, that is taken care of, that is knowledgeable, having a workforce that is knowledgeable and well compensated can really bring together the type of quality that we're looking for. So in my experience, I'm gonna start with one of my first experiences. I was a reading tutor in a first grade classroom, and I worked for the America Reads program, which is a volunteer program, but it gave me the experience in the classroom to start off, to get my feet wet. And I had a 7-year-old boy in a classroom that was behind in his reading and writing. And I was a tutor that would come in once a week for an hour to work with the 7-year-old to get him on reading level, to get him on his reading level. And in my time spending in this classroom, I learned so much about and I always wanted to be a teacher, but I learned how difficult it is to balance so many things that happen in the classroom and also taking care of yourself. So in this portion of this conversation, I'd like to really have everybody think about 3 things. The early childhood workforce crisis, it's a reality. It was a reality before the pre-pandemic. We knew that there was wage gaps. We knew that there was a decline in the early childhood workforce. And specifically for family childcare, we saw that in Massachusetts, there was thousands of licenses that have been going away. So we understand that the workforce crisis has been exacerbated as this pandemic has happened, and it's given us an opportunity to think about what are some better solutions and how to break down some of these systemic issues that have been happening for years and that we see that are happening more. As I alluded to, the decline in family childcare programs, we know that we need a cohesive field. In early childhood education, we have center-based programs, we have out-of-school time in the workforce, and we have family childcare. But we see that, unfortunately, we're not looking at our field as a cohesive field. And it's a necessity to kind of break down these barriers, not just for one side or for another, but really look at the early childhood workforce through the lens of coming together and looking at how to break down the issues that are happening, because they're not only are they real, but they're hurting the workforce. We lose great teachers. We lose great people that are dedicated, that have set forth in working in early childhood education. But unfortunately, because of so many reasons that are out of their own control, have left the field. And I'd like to share, this was during the pandemic. I have a lot of stories before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, I had a family childcare educator tell me, I can't afford my home. I can't afford a living wage. I can't pay for the things that I have. And this is an educated woman that had many years in the field, that has great experience, built great relationships with the children and families that she works with, did an incredible job with curriculum, because we have to break down all the silos of how we look at our workforce. It's such an important point to point out that whether you're in an out of school time program or a family childcare home or in a center-based program, our educators step up and they demonstrate quality in many different ways. I see it, I teach college courses I'm an adjunct, and I see how much effort our workforce puts in terms of what the work that they do. They understand curriculum, they understand what it needs and what it takes to work with children and families. And in the long run, they're not compensated for it, or they're not set forth, and they're not being respected, quite frankly, for the work that they're doing. So this particular family childcare educator had the case that she had to shut down her program after many, many years of working in early childhood, and wasn't the only case. In the pandemic, we saw many good programs close down because we already had these issues, and they become such a great issue, a bigger issue. The last piece that I'd really like to focus on is thinking about the workforce and how to protect our workforce. We need to think about how to break down the barriers for and really have a cohesive approach of how to protect not only every workforce, but also the Black and Brown and the minority communities, because those are the ones that are mostly being affected. So if we think about how can we change policies and procedures, and we have a great opportunity when we think about hope and how we can make some changes. Funding is not the only way that's going to fix this. We are going to have to think creatively, openly, to break down some barriers and look at systems differently so that we can have a workforce that's happy, that's educated, that can bring forth and raise the quality. So I urge you to think outside of the traditional ways that we look at early childhood education and really bring a cohesive approach. For example, in Massachusetts, we're having conversations about subsidies or not subsidies. Educators are educators. We should be thinking about how we compensate well all of our educators, regardless of the situation that the family has or that the educator has. So I would like to close with thinking about a different way of breaking down barriers, making systemic changes financially, structurally, and also thinking about the quality of programs. We can do this if we take the opportunity to listen to the voices and really speak up and try to protect our workforce. So that's my piece. I would like to introduce Joanne Borinski, who's a master teacher and has some great experience and information to share.
Well, thank you, Rosemary. That was very well done. So I guess what I'm going to be talking about is the side of the group childcare, because that's been my experience all my life. And personal story is that my journey began in the 70s in early childhood. You know, I got my bachelor's degree in early childhood. Actually, it was in elementary ed, because then they didn't have early childhood. It was a specialization. So you could do the math. I've seen the ups and downs in early childhood in terms of education and experience and lack of compensation. I've been through the rallies for equal pay for equal work, you know, way back when. I've been through EECs in Massachusetts, the programs and the processes where we wanted to see all teachers with bachelor's degrees. And, you know, early childhood people pulled through. We did. We got our bachelor's degrees, and we worked really hard to help everybody get their bachelor's degrees. And what we didn't anticipate was that we weren't going to get compensated for it. So we were left there with all these well-educated people, thank God, but they weren't being compensated. So what happened? They left. They're smart people. They left. They said, we're going to public school. We're going to go to Head Start. We're going to go to admin jobs, or we're going to leave the field altogether. And that's what they did. there was no incentive to stay, except for the love of the children. But, you can't live on the love of children to pay your bills, etc. So then we had COVID, and COVID was really good in the fact that it helped us to see that early childhood was essential and how essential it really is. People can't work without having childcare. So they said, childcare is essential. It's wonderful. And EEC, the early childhood field really stood up during COVID. And I know here in my little community of Worcester and surrounding towns, the programs stayed open and they did everything possible to keep themselves, the children, the families safe, and to, so that the people could keep going to work. I know that the company that I work for, Edward Street, we worked really hard to work with the hospitals and the healthcare agencies, the transportation people, everybody, the grocery store people, to get them childcare so that they could go to work. And now I look at when I walk into the classrooms, I know it started, as Rosemary said, before COVID, but I look in the classrooms now and it's so very, very sad because I see educators, wonderful, wonderful people. They just don't have the capacity, the experience, the knowledge, the content knowledge in order to help children in the classroom, especially where we have children that are, I heard somebody call them COVID babies or COVID children, because a lot of the kids are lagging in self-help skills. They have more, we're seeing more children that are probably on the spectrum, and we're seeing lags in social skills and speech problems. And we're expecting people, educators that don't have that content knowledge to, to help these children. And it's not fair. It's not fair to them and it's not fair to the kids. Just as an example, I walked into a classroom the other day and there were 10 children. Now you have to visualize this. There were 10 children in the classroom with one teacher. And the teacher had, just basic child growth and development and a few other early childhood classes. So she didn't have that much content knowledge. She didn't have that much experience, very young educator. One child is diagnosed with autism. One child was diagnosed with hearing issues plus developmental delays. Another was diagnosed with visual challenges and developmental delays. And one child had Down syndrome. And there were 6 other children who are typically developing, yet again, with those COVID issues, with lacking social skills, lacking self-help skills, etc. So the directors go into the classrooms to try and help them. We know that directors are all in there giving breaks and trying to, if somebody calls in, that disrupts everything. You have to go in there and sub for everybody. And they don't have time to do any of their work, so they're exhausted, they're frustrated, as well as the educators. And, we have to do something about this. Seeing the ups and downs through the past 40 years, I've never seen it this low, this bad. And it gives me pause because when I say these things, I don't want people to feel that we have all classrooms are not like that, but a lot of them are. And I know that directors who used to rave, and we're so proud of their programs about how high quality they were, they don't say those things anymore because they know how much, they've, they're lagging behind. So, yeah, so it's really difficult. Mental health issues, oh my goodness. I mean, that's just another category too. We need to help these educators in children with mental health issues and caring for themselves so that they can care for the children. That's one of the things that I try to do in every training that I do or every reflective talk that I have is, what are you doing for yourself so that you can take care of these kids? Anyway, that's the downside of it. But I think the positive side, and I have to do this really briefly, but I think the positive side is in Massachusetts, we have what we're talking about in Common Start legislation in Massachusetts, which is a House bill. And it will help us to get high quality education, high quality and affordable education and care for our parents and our kids' providers. And also it will help in a way to get better compensation for the workforce. But the state has to put in and really back up this, the money for this. The state really has to support it for the compensation. I think that as Rosemary said and Dr. Austin said, we have to get the younger folks in advocacy positions. We have to get them involved. And that's really important. So I try and do everything I can to help them to advocate for themselves and their families and their kids. Join your professional organization. NACE is national. And for us in Massachusetts, it's Mass AYC. And for myself, it's the local organization. It's the Worcester County chapter, which I am co-president of. So I try and get them involved, the younger folks, because it's for them that we're doing this. I'm going to be retired in a few years. So I want to see this going, so that when I leave, I know that there's going to be something happening. In organizations like CAYL and Strategies for Children, they help us keep us informed, and they're really, on the top of connecting people, which is so important. So there's so much that can be done, but we need to start. And I read an article today from the federal banking system in Boston, which said, we can do this. We just need legislation to back it up. And we need commitment from the state and our business leaders too. So I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to turn it over to our group discussion. So thank you so much.
Wow, I've learned so much from the three of you. I really appreciate what you're saying. And I just want to start off by acknowledging, I'm watching the chat, and I want to start off by noticing that, a lot of the information that has been shared by Leah, Rosemary, and by Joanne, it's not happy news. They're telling you the reality of what it's like on the ground. And in the case of Leah Austin, what the national picture looks like. We can't fix it if we don't face it. So we have to face it. And there are many opportunities that we can move forward. But the thing is, you move forward to opportunity based on the reality and facing your realities. So I really appreciate the courage that you two as practitioners, Rosemary and Joanne are bringing to the forefront, because that is the truth that many people are experiencing, and it has to be acknowledged that that is the experience. And thank you so much also, Leah, for sharing with us behind the scenes some of the pushback that you get as you're sharing these realities. So for all of you, I really appreciate your courage and the fact that you stay with this field and you are all in positions to encourage and inspire so many people. So thank you for that. I want to turn to what we can do to improve our lot. And many of you have talked about the importance of advocacy. Unionization was mentioned, working through our professional associations was mentioned, and so forth. What signs do you see out there that people have the appetite, the strength, and the willingness to move forward? Of course, Build Back Better is inspiring a lot of people. As Leah has pointed out, there are still questions that have to be asked when Build Back Better is passed. And I'm going to say that in the affirmative because we're also hopeful of that. But what signs do you see that people are going to be like you, Joanne, and stick with it for 40 years and grow in their skills and just not move on to a different career? Any of you? What are the signs you see for positive change?
Well, I think that, as I said before, the younger people are starting to advocate. We just had a rally for Common Start a couple Saturdays ago, and there were a lot of young parents, which is what we need to get is families together. So we're really seeing the surge of getting families involved and young educators. We're getting ready to plan, young educators are planning to show no small matter to the legislation and the workforce, because so that people are more aware of what's happening in this, in this field.
Thank you.
Well, Laura, I'd like to add that in this phase of what we're facing in early childhood education, there has been new opportunities that are coming up. I think that there are new partners. For example, businesses have, the business industry has stepped up. Legislators want to know more about our field and our workforce. The unions are helping educators understand their right and how they can be informed. We have workforce development agencies that are giving us opportunities to train and co-train, and we have more people that are in tune to what the early childhood workforce is. I think we have opportunities to share and have more energy, more synergy together, and looking at a fresh way of how to educate our educators, right? With colleges and CDAs and all of these things, and really looking at how our new partners that are committed to us, that are looking at, it's almost like a national light has been come upon us in early childhood education that has never been there before. And we are seeing a lot of partners and a lot of people that are interested. And I think this is our chance to kind of expand, explore, and look at early childhood education in a different way. We're funding our educators differently, and we're trying to push those envelopes. I think we're trying to really look at the partners that have experienced other industries have experienced things like this, and I think we're going to learn how to figure this out if we work cohesively and we include more partners. We need others to understand what are some of the issues that are happening in this workforce, and people are going to stick around. They're going to be here for the long run.
Thank you.
And if I could just build on that, one example, I'll drop it in the chat here. I think that illustrates what Rosemary, you were just saying about, some of the groups and coming together and gaining momentum. In the 90s, there was a very active Worthy Wage campaign that was led by teachers and family childcare providers. I see Joanne nodding, so I'm sure I can imagine Joanne was probably leading a chapter somewhere, right? And they were so active and worked with parents, and we're seeing a reemergence of that. North Carolina specifically, a group there has, through the North Carolina Early Education Coalition, really kind of resurrected Worthy Wage the Worthy Wage movement and a Worthy Wage campaign. And we know that there are pockets that are calling themselves different things, but there are groups of educators all across the country who are coming together in really similar ways to be very vocal advocates for themselves and weighing in on policies and resource allocation in communities.
Mhm. Yeah, I also see a lot more business involvement, and again, I think those of us who've been around a while, we've seen these cycles of business involvement happening in the past. It's not the first time, but I think business is taking a much stronger stance in wanting to support the early childhood education field, and that is also a very positive development as well. You know, we're all thinking about Build Back Better, and I know there's lots of activities that are happening in the state. So we see that, and even if Build Back Better passes, which we hope that it will, the need for advocacy at the state level is going to be even stronger as the framework is really goes into implementation. What are some of the questions in terms of the workforce and alleviating the workforce crisis that you believe that Build Back Better and some of the other state initiatives might be able to bring forward?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. Initially, I mean, I think at the state level and with resources that we hope will be coming through Build Back Better, there's a real opportunity to collect some basic information, right? I think we have to hold states, put their feet to the fire here and hold them accountable to say, like, how are you using these resources to tell us where the money is going, right? Who is participating in public programs? What do we know about kind of who gets what? What we know, right now is that there's just not enough good data collection. And so the lack of data allows so many of our inequities to persist, right? If you don't see the racial wage gaps in front of you, if you don't see the infant, toddler, preschool wage gaps in front of you and know what that looks like, not just at the national level, but to say, here's what this is in, Wisconsin, and here's what it is in this county in Wisconsin. I think there's a real opportunity with new programs to do that from the outset and to say, in order to move forward, in order to ensure equity for the workforce, as well as equity for what children and families have access to, like as a kind of basic level, we've got to get some, clear data, simple, it doesn't have to be complex, but simple, which allows, all of us to have, to hold these programs and resources and policymakers, accountable to how these programs actually roll out and how we need to adjust and make changes over time to work towards equity.
Thank you for that. Any other comments?
I'd just like to piggyback on what Leah was just saying, that years ago, Wellesley College did some research on family childcare, and we're talking about maybe 10 years ago, and they said just the highlight of the data was the family childcare providers, once they have all their expenses and you calculate how much is their hourly wage, they came up to $4 an hour. That's the amount that family childcare educators would make an hour. And I think that you're right, Leah, that the information that we need is data to kind of show a combination of stories, of course, but really showing how our educators are suffering because they don't have the wages that they need. We all know anecdotally that our workforce, for example, is eligible for the same kind of safety nets that families are going through as well. So our workforce is eligible for the Department of Transition funds that are available. So when you think about this, this is mind-boggling that you have a workforce that works 50 hours minimum a week that can be eligible for things that they should be able to afford on their own. So we need to think about how we can support our workforce and also looking through it in the lens of data. And I'm so glad that you, Valora, Amanda, and others are thinking about how we can showcase this. And one thing that has really come up on this pandemic is that we're beefing up as business. We're not just childcare. We're not just educating children, but we also are businesses that have to survive. And I think that's one thing that has come up, and we're gonna really look at it at building the data to kind of say, this is what we need and how it's distributed.
And the hour goes so fast. I want to ask one final question, and I'd like to really get your sense, because I think people are really excited about the potential of Build Back Better and what that can mean in the States. So as directors and staff are facing recruitment challenges right now and staffing challenges right now, I want each of you to give a realistic assessment, because there's work to be done. We are not going to go to January 1st, 2022, and everybody's going to have a better salary. So I want to ask you if you can guesstimate or give some kind of information to our audience. When will educators, when might they expect higher salaries to really kick in? When might they expect that? Because this is what people want to know. Leah?
Oh, that's a $1 million question. I mean, it's hard to predict, right? But I think, assuming Build Back Better goes forward, you're right, it's not going to change on a dime. I would say by the time we get to the end of 2022, we should have a plan for states to be utilizing their funding. I mean, we know how states and the federal government move, but I think we could really see by this time next year, we could know what does it mean when we say living wages, because now those funds are coming. What does it mean to say, there's going to be a wage scale and a wage ladder in states. And we know states are beginning, some have been working on this for a long time, others are beginning to work on these things. And then there are also states and local communities that are just moving ahead, right? That they're figuring out what they can do now with their local dollars to, change wages or offer financial relief. But I think real meaningful, long-term, sustainable increased wages. The reality is we are going to be a year out, if not longer, before we really start to see this throughout our communities. Though I think there's opportunities for states to be doing things now to begin to address wages, even with some of the pandemic relief dollars, and provide financial relief to the workforce.
Thank you. Joanne?
I'd just like to add to that, I think that higher ed, we have to connect with higher ed too, in order to provide education for, for the educators, because it's really been a real disconnect here in Massachusetts, as far as some of us can see, when EEC disrupted, changed their process a couple of years ago. So we don't see as much early childhood courses in higher ed as we used to. So we really have to formulate that and get them connected to. And there are certain pilots that we can look to show that it does work, like the PEG grant that we had at the Boston Public Schools, which was a federal initiative in 5 cities in Massachusetts, and also the CPPI, which is a subcategory of the PEG grant, which is the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. So there are pilots and programs that we can look to.
It's time for us to wrap up, but what I want to end is by encouraging everyone to get involved strategically with other people in your community, because there are very many decisions that are yet to be made, and your voice matters a lot in asking the questions and ensuring that the right supports are going to the workforce. So please get involved. This is a critical time for all of us. We've got to change the game for the workforce. Our nation depends on it. We all need it. Our colleagues need it, that we get the respect that we've heard is lacking from our practitioners today, that we've got to clarify the competencies and make sure in whatever we're doing, we're going to continue to have high quality, which Joanne spoke to. And I also think it's really important that we focus on our strengths and build towards strengths. And know what we're strong at, what we believe in, and how we're going to move forward. So I thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to invite you to participate in a Q&A with our panelists. There's a link that's being dropped in the chat. If you want to have a conversation with our panelists, you can go straight to that link and we will have a conversation with the panelists. As all of you know, this is donation season and giving season. So we encourage and invite you to donate to CAYL if you're so inclined to. And on behalf of all of our team at the CAYL Institute, I want to thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to coming back with you with a new webinar series in 2022. Meanwhile, we wish that each of you will have a happy and safe holiday season. Please join our panelists in the Zoom meeting. The link has been put in the chat and you will have opportunity to directly ask questions to our panelists. Thank you very much and good evening.